Šta je sloboda? Pitali smo Francisa Fukuyamu, jednog od najvažnijih neokonzervativnih ekonomskih teoretičara i čovjeka koji je proglasio kraj istorije sada već daleke 1989. godine. Profesor na Univerzitetu Stanford govorio je za BHRT o tome da li je pobjeda kapitalizma padom bastiona komunističke ideologije poput Sovjetskog saveza, ali i Berlinskog zida zaista označila početak novog doba prosperiteta za čitavu planetu. I kakvo mjesto u takvom uređenju zauzima jedna tranziciona država poput Bosne i Hercegovine? Da li je istorija zaista završila 1989. Živimo li u postistorijskom vremenu? Ili postoji nešto pored kapitalizma? Mr. Fukuyama, thank you very much for agreeing to this interview. I wanted to start off with a question regarding the present that we're in. It's 2017. It's been almost 20 years since you declared, so to speak, the end of history. Has the history actually ended, or do we live in a post-historical times, or has the history come back to haunt us?
Well, first of all, the concept of the end of history was the Marxist idea that history was progressive and that there's a succession of different types of society, from agrarian to feudal to industrial. And the Marxists said that at the end of that process lay communism. And my argument back in 1989 was that we weren't going to get there, that the end of history looked more like what the Marxists called bourgeois democracy. And I think that's still true. I think that's still the highest form of social organization there is. But I think maintaining a modern liberal democracy is actually quite a difficult thing. And we've had backsliding over the past 10 years with authoritarian countries, and especially now with populist nationalist regimes that have part of the formula. They're democratic, or they seek democratic legitimacy through elections, but they're not liberal. They don't maintain a rule of law. They don't maintain checks and balances in the system. And I think that's the threat that we're under right now.
You're in a country that is undergoing transition. It was a part of a socialist country back in the 90s, and around the same time when your book came out, the country steadily fell apart. This is one of the 7 states that have come out of that. What is happening here? Is this a very sort of problematic, let's call it, period in our history that's been going on for 25 years, where there doesn't seem to be an end to this transition?
Yeah, I think that this has been a region where nationalism and identity politics has been particularly virulent, and unfortunately the kinds of political institutions that have been created, in order to stop the conflict in the 1990s have locked in place that kind of politics, and I think that's why this region seems to be very much stuck. The other problem is that outside powers have interests here, so it's the EU, United States, Russia, all of which have been playing out their rivalries in this region, and that, I think, doesn't help the area's stability either.
How do you get it unstuck?
Well, that's not an easy question. I think that ultimately you don't deal with these systemic issues of corruption, state capture, national identity without the elites in those societies taking control of the situation and shaping things. And I think one of the problems, especially in Bosnia, is that people don't feel they are in control of their own destinies, that because of the importance of outside actors, they feel like they're acted upon, but they don't have the power to do anything. And I think until that attitude changes, it is going to be actually hard to, create a modern state that's not based on ethnicity and narrow nationalism.
You have the outside actors, and then you have the what you call gunslingers and their BMWs. Except the gunslingers aren't the actual capitalists or people who deal with the market per se. They're politicians. Is that an unusual scenario for transitional countries?
Well, it's not an unusual situation historically. I think that many regimes in history have been elites that basically have made a deal among themselves, that they grab hold of power in the state and they use that power to extract resources for themselves. And you get stability because they've got a pact where they share those resources and then cut out, the rest of the society. And historically, that kind of regime has provided short-run stability, but it's not ultimately legitimate, and it ultimately, doesn't become powerful because power is too much wrapped up in a very small circle of elites. And so I think the pressures of modernization are what's led other countries to develop more genuinely democratic and inclusive institutions. And I think the hope has always been that that kind of process would unfold here as well.
What you currently have here, many people at least feel that way, is this turbo capitalism that has entered all the economic spheres in the country. How do you progress from where we are right now to a more stable, let's say, capitalist system? Or is capitalism really the answer for countries such as Bosnia, these tiny, small economic players?
Well, first of all, there's no choice. I mean, there's no other economic system than capitalism. The question is whether it's opened or closed. And I think that the kinds of systems that you have in the Balkans are state-dominated, where the state is the major employer. It's not genuinely competitive. It's not really seeking to integrate itself into a larger capitalist market. And I think the promise of the European Union and membership in the European Union is that precisely these economies would open themselves up and face genuine competition where they really have to modernize and where they can't depend on the state for continued support. People can't depend on the state for employment. And if that happens, then I think that capitalism actually becomes a help to democracy and to a more open liberal order.
But capitalism isn't necessarily meritocracy.
Well, but capitalism does, if you have a genuinely competitive system, it forces a kind of meritocracy. If you're just giving business to your cronies, that's fine as long as you're living in a closed market with no efficient companies competing against you. But the moment you actually have to genuinely compete on a level playing field, then it turns out you have to hire competent managers. You can't just, use nepotism as a resource.
Do you think there is a country that's representative of that kind of capitalism right now in 2017?
Well, that's what the European Union represents. The whole idea is that these are countries that exist on a level playing field with common rules about economic commerce, and in fact, the core of the EU is competitive. I mean, there are things they do that restrict that competition, but the principle is an open market.
Bosnia is a country that's trying to join the EU, as you know, and it's that's been on that path for the past 25 years or so. Slowly but surely, I think we're getting there. But what interests me from your point of view is what kind of European Union are we entering? Is it the same European Union that it was 20 years or 25 years ago? And how will that affect us entering the EU right now?
Well, obviously the EU has been going through a crisis that started with the Greek debt crisis and then the migrant crisis and Brexit. I think that period is probably over, that the EU hit a kind of nadir and is beginning to recover with the elections in the Netherlands and in France this past year, where I think the populists were pretty decisively defeated and that threat was pushed back. And even in Britain, it appears that British voters are having second thoughts about whether they actually really want to leave. Unfortunately, they're kind of stuck with that policy, but it's not clear that there's a consensus that they want to get out of the European Union. So I think that, with a certain amount of leadership from France and Germany, the EU can return to being an ongoing project. They've got to fix some big problems. They've got to decide whether to go forward or actually to pull back, because right now they're in this kind of uncomfortable middle position. But I do think that, it's going to remain a symbol of modern government, in many ways, that government exists not to enrich the people running the government, but really to serve a broader public interest.
So you've already mentioned the Greek crisis. Some of the countries that have also joined, that have belonged to the Eastern Bloc, have also had trouble adapting to the demands of the European market. Same thing happened to Croatia by certain critics who are saying that entering the EU was also detrimental to Croatia. Do small countries really have a chance when facing these larger economies such as Germany or France?
Well, in economic terms, I mean, there's always going to be a competitive niche for the smallest country. The problem, I think, is more in institutions. I think the accession process by which the EU says, okay, you can get in only if you meet the following criteria, is actually quite helpful as an incentive for institutional reform. The problem in the EU is that once you get in, there's no disciplining mechanism so that you can start to slide backwards in terms of corruption or weak rule of law, and the EU can't really do very much about it. And in fact, the internal politics of the EU oftentimes means that the leading countries aren't paying attention, or they really don't have the political energy to discipline the members that aren't playing by the rules. And I mean, Greece was really the first case of this, but I think some of the other newer members have had similar kinds of problems.
Yeah. Many say that Croatia was actually at its best and was going through its golden age while it was going through the process of joining the EU.
Well, that's because there was a positive goal and an incentive to, fix policies. But once you're in, you can kind of relax and, go back to your old bad habits.
Right. Let's spread out from Europe to a more global situation. You were a part of the say previous presidencies in the U.S., especially the Republican ones. You have worked under Reagan, you have worked under Bush Sr., and then from what I can tell, you kind of took a stance, or you went away from the politics of Bush Jr., and now we have President Trump. What is your take on what's going on in the U.S., both politically but also economically, because as we know, the U.S. economy affects the global economy.
Sure. Well, several things happened. I mean, I broke with the Republican Party under George W. Bush because of the Iraq War, because I thought that they really misjudged American power and misused it. And I think with every passing year it becomes, even more clear, what a huge mistake that invasion was in terms of American prestige and the, lives and money that were wasted and the instability that set off in that entire region. Since then, the Republican Party has just walked off a cliff, as far as I'm concerned. I mean, they've moved in this extremely conservative direction, first towards this Tea Party position, which exaggerates the kind of underlying American distrust of government, but takes it to, I think, ridiculous extremes. And then Trump has come along and seems to have pushed it in a populist direction. He's an economic nationalist, or has been right from the start, although if you look at what he's actually done since he's been president, he's essentially been carrying out this conservative minimal government agenda and not the populist agenda. So most populists, like in Latin America, come into power and they give benefits to their supporters, their working class supporters. He's threatening to take away health insurance from, more than 20 million Americans. So I don't think he's actually a populist. He's some kind of just incoherent. I guess that's his real problem, is that I'm not sure that he has a real underlying ideology. I think he's mostly interested in his own power and, personal reputation, rather than any kind of consistent set of policies he wants to enact.
How is that going to affect your average American citizen? Because we are at the very beginning of his 4 years of his mandate. Well,
it's not clear. I think that for reasons that don't have much to do with him, the economy may do well in the next few years. The whole global economy looks like it's picking up. So if that continues, I think Americans will feel good about themselves, and even if he doesn't have much influence over what happens, you know, it may make him popular. The real danger, I think, lies in foreign policy, where a president really does have a lot of authority, and there's a lot of things that could happen that could be really destabilizing. I think right now the most dangerous situation is in Korea, North Korea, where you could actually have a shooting war break out in the coming months and years. And if that happens, then the knock-on effects to the global economy are going to be enormous, because everybody's so tightly bound up with each other economically that if you actually have some real conflict, that's going to have terrible consequences.
A conflict with North Korea would be on a very major scale. It would probably be even bigger than what was happening in Iraq and in Libya even.
Well, sure, and it involves China directly, and so it's a very dangerous situation.
Do you think that Trump can continue with this policy of interventions that George W. Bush has started with post 9/11? Or?
Well, it's not clear. I mean, this is the problem with him. It's not clear what he really wants to do. He's delegated more authority to the military, and the military doesn't like to lose, and so there's been a gradual ramping up of, the American presence in Syria and Iraq and Afghanistan and so forth. Whether that's just going to continue without any political supervision is not clear. Whether Trump, I also suspect that Trump doesn't want to get into a major war, and it's not going to help him particularly. The problem, I think, is miscalculation. He may feel in the short run, like the missile strike against Syria, that he can do something dramatic, that'll change the situation, and then he can walk away from it, and then get a lot of political credit back in the United States. And that, that's possible, that could happen, but I think it's also something that could set off a much longer and much more devastating conflict.
Would you say that there's also a possibility that somebody could wrongly advise him that it would be good for the economy to start a war, because we know what happened in World War II?
I don't think any of the team that he's got around him is likely to argue something like that. I mean, maybe someone like Steve Bannon might, but the people actually running foreign policy, James Mattis and H.R. McMaster and Rex Tillerson, I think have their heads screwed on right. These are not the kind of people that are going to push for some kind of adventurous policy simply for domestic purposes. Well, talking more about what's in terms of global economy, you're saying that the economy globally is recovering. What are your predictions in terms of where the world is heading in terms of just economy and further development? Well, the global economy over the last 20 years has had one big structural problem. It's actually done pretty well. There have been some major financial crises and setbacks, but overall, people have been getting richer, trade has been expanding. That has brought a lot of tensions because the benefits have not been distributed equally. And so in every single country, you've got this surplus of capital and a buildup of oligarchs. This is true in China, in Russia, in the United States, in Latin America. There's a layer of people with a lot of money and therefore a lot of political influence. And conversely, you have rising middle classes in places like China and India, but then declining middle classes in Europe and in North America. And that's what's been driving the populist politics, and that's what's been driving a backlash against globalization. And so that suggests that, this kind of development, this uneven development, is not good for democratic political stability. But you could say the criticism of this kind of development is actually, it does make sense. And you've had the 1% movement in the U.S. and most of the critics on the left say that the future is very bleak if this continues. How do you resolve this issue? How do you make the playing field more even? Well, I think part of the answer is just traditional redistributive politics. I think that's what stabilized European democracy after World War II, is governments that realized that they had to maintain social safety nets and welfare protections for their citizens to reduce the level of inequality that the market produced, and I think that's going to continue to be the case. The problem, I think, is really technology more than anything else, which has been driving the erosion of jobs for workers with lower levels of skill. You know, if you only have a high school education, much harder to get work these days, and I think that's a process that's going to continue.
And technology has led us to telescoping as well, so it feels like we're constantly catching up with the demands of the market.
Well, yeah, that may be true. I think the market has been racing ahead of societies for a couple of hundred years now. There's an appearance that things are moving faster simply because the latest technologies are really related to information and communications, and so we perceive things that are changing that we may not have perceived, 100 years ago.
Is there another technological breakthrough somewhere in front of us that will again change the way that we perceive the world? That's happened with the internet in the 90s. It doesn't seem like we've had a significant discovery like that since.
Well, if I could answer that question, I'd be a really rich person.
Well, me too, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's possible. One thing I would observe is that a lot of the big advances that are likely to happen in the next generation are in the area of biomedicine. And in that realm, I'm not sure that the impact on human life is actually going to be as positive as, the invention of indoor plumbing or electricity or the internal combustion engine. It's going to allow people to live longer, but whether that actually improves the quality of their lives, whether that doesn't produce a different set of social disruptions that may have, some very difficult social consequences, it's very hard to predict.
Is there an end to inequality?
Well, I don't think that there will be an end to it. In fact, modern technology has exacerbated inequality in many ways because it's given big financial rewards to people with cognitive abilities, with education, and since the education is not equally distributed, it creates social divisions.
Freedom has many facets. What would you say that freedom is in 2017?
I think that freedom is under attack. In many respects, democracy is turning against liberalism. That is to say, liberalism is the rule of law that protects individuals, that limits what governments can do. And I think the rise of this kind of populist nationalism means that leaders are using democratic legitimacy to undermine the rule of law. That's really what's going on in Russia under Putin, in Turkey under Erdogan, Hungary under Orban, so forth. And I think Donald Trump represents that same trend. He attacks the media, he attacks kind of the intelligence community when it gets in his way. He attacks, virtually every other institution that doesn't serve his own interests. The only difference is that in America we have pretty strong institutions, and I think he's not going to get very far. But, in places where institutions are weaker, I think freedom in that sense of protection by law is eroding.
Is that the freedom we should aspire to, protection by law?
Well, I think that's the basic form. I mean, liberal democracy is a combination of rule of law and democratic accountability, and the two have to be held in balance, and each one has to be independently respected.
Thank you very much for this interview, Mr. Fukuyama.
Thank you very much.